How's it going? No messing around today with intros. I'm 007. 007. Today we're going to look at the hidden origins of the Bank of England. I think you might find this quite interesting. So, the hidden origins of the Bank of England. All great events have been distorted, most of the important causes concealed. If the history of England is ever written by one who has the knowledge and the courage, the world would be astonished. That was Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Back in ancient England, King Offa ruled the Kingdom of Mercia, which was bounded by the rivers Trent and Mersey in the north, the Thames Valley in the south, Wales in the west, and East Anglia and Essex in the east, from 757 to 791 AD. It was one of the 7 autonomous kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy. Offa was a wise and able administrator and a kind-hearted leader. He established the first monetary system in England. On account of the scarcity of gold, he used silver for coinage and as a store of wealth. The standard unit of exchange was a pound of silver divided into 240 pennies. The pennies were stamped with a star, the Old English stera, from which the word sterling is derived. In 787, King Offa introduced a statute prohibiting usury, the charging of interest on money lent, a concept which dates back to the pagan era. The laws against usury were further entrenched by King Alfred in 865 to 899, who directed that the property of users be forfeited, while in 1050, Edward the Confessor 1042 to 1066 decreed not only forfeiture, but that a usurer can be declared an outlaw and banished for life. The first Jewish migration and expulsion. The Jews first arrived in England in 1066, in the wake of William I's defeat of King Harold II at Hastings on 14th of October. These Jews came from Rouen, 75 miles 121 kilometers from Falaise in Normandy, where William the Conqueror was born illegitimately as William the Bastard. Although the historical record does not indicate whether they promoted the idea of a military invasion of England, these Jews had at very least financed it. For this support, they were richly rewarded by being allowed to practice usury under royal protection. The consequences for the English people were disastrous. By charging rates of interest of 33% per annum on lands mortgaged by nobles and 300% per annum on tools of trade or chattels pledged by workmen, within 2 generations, 1/4 of all English lands was in the hands of Jewish usurers. At his death in 1186, Aaron of Lincoln was declared to be the richest man in England, and it was estimated that his wealth exceeded that of Henry VI. Furthermore, the Jewish immigrants undermined the ethos of the guilds and exasperated the English merchants by selling a large variety of goods under one roof. They also played a prominent role in the clipping of silver coins and the melting of them into bullion and the plating of tin with silver. The famous economist, Dr. William Cunningham, compares the activity of the activity of the Jews in England from the 11th century onward to a sponge, which sucks up all the wealth of the land and thereby hinders all economic development. Interesting too is the proof that even at this early period, the government did everything in its power to make Jews take up decent trades and honest work, and thereby at the same time amalgamate with the rest of the population, but all to no purpose. In the beginning of the 13th century, many nobles were in danger of losing their lands through usury and taxation. In 1207, an enormous sum of £60,000 was levied in taxes on the Christian population. The Jews also paid tax, but at a lower rate and on grossly understated income and wealth. Nobles who borrowed from the Jewish moneylenders and from the king and his agents had to have their mortgages registered on the treasury rolls. As soon as a noble got into financial difficulty, the king would buy the debt from the moneylender and seize the land for himself. King John, 1199 to 1216, was utterly reckless in pursuit of this depraved and dishonest policy, and was moreover profligate, incompetent, and utterly beholden to his Jews. In 1215, the nobles revolted and forced King John to sign the Magna Carta on the 15th of June 1215. This document consists of 61 clauses relating to the establishment of various constitutional and legal rights, but its principal purpose was to cancel the bonds of the Jewish moneylenders and to abolish usury and the privileged position of the Jews. On the 19th of October 1216, King John died and was succeeded by his 9-year-old son Henry III, who ruled from 1219 to 1272. His reign was little better than that of his father, and 19 of the clauses affecting the Jews were abrogated the following year. However, his heir, Edward I, 1272 to 1307, soon realized that Jews had no place in English society, and that if he did not take action, he would be in danger of losing his throne. In 1233 and 1275, statutes of Jewry were passed, which abolished all forms of usury. As many of these Jews could no longer earn a living, a statute was passed by King Edward on the 18th of July 1290, compelling the entire Jewish population of 16,511 to leave England forever. One of over 100 expulsions which have been recorded throughout European history. The announcement was greeted with great joy and jubilation throughout the land. Unlike the modern practice of ethnic cleansing, the Jews, after paying a tax of 1/15 of the value of their movables and 1/10 of their specie, were permitted to leave with all their goods and chattels. Any Jew who remained after the 1st of November 1290, All Saints' Day, was liable to be executed. The barons, including Arthur's ancestor Roger Bertram, Lord of Mitford, forced King John to sign the Magna Carta in Runnymede on the 12th of June 1215. The glorious Middle Ages. As accurate and honest and truthful to real life as the days of our lives. With the banishment of the moneylenders and the abolition of usury, taxes... It's going to be difficult to read. With the banishment of the moneylenders and the abolition of usury, taxes were moderate and there was no state debt. There were no state debts, as the interest-free tally stick was used for government expenditures. This ancient instrument of finance, known to the Saracens and possibly also to the Chinese, is derived from the Latin word talia, meaning a stick. The stick was made out of hazel, willow or boxwood because these woods split easily. They were usually 8 inches in length from forearm to thumb and ½ inch, 1.3 centimeters wide, although they could be kept up to 8 feet long. The denominations were indicated by different sized cuts in the wood. The £1,000 were marked by cutting the thickness of the palm of the hand, £100 by the breadth of the little finger, £1 that of a swelling barleycorn. Shillings somewhat less, and pence were marked by incisions. The payee was recorded on the flat sides. When all the details had been recorded on the tally, it was split nearly to the bottom, so that one part retained a stump or handle in which a hole could be bored. This was known as the counter tally or counterfoil, and was held by the exchequer at the exchequer. The flat strip without the stump was given to the payee. As no two pieces of wood are identical, it was impossible to forge a tally stick. Tally sticks were first introduced during the reign of King Henry II, 1100 to 1135, and would remain in circulation until 1783. It was, however, during the period 1290 to 1485 that tallies would reach their apogee and constitute the principal means of state finance tallies. Sorry, I'm having difficulty reading this because of the picture in the background, as you can see. They were used not only to pay state salaries, but to finance major items of infrastructure, such as construction of the wall of the city of London, public buildings and ports. The exact amount of tallies in circulation is not known, but as late as 1694, 17 million worth was still in existence. This was a prodigious sum, as the king's annual budget rarely exceeded 2.5 million, and a labourer earned a penny a day. English people are going to love this. Imagine this. With tolerable taxes, no state debt, and no interest to pay, England enjoyed a period of unparalleled growth and prosperity. The average labourer worked only 14 weeks and enjoyed 160 to 180 holidays.
Say what?
According to Lord William Leverhulme, a writer of that time, the men of the 15th century were very well paid. In fact, so well paid that the purchasing power of their wages and their standard of living would only be exceeded in the late 19th century. A labourer could provide all the necessities his family required. They were well clothed in good woolen cloth and had plenty of meat and bread. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Anglo-German philosopher, confirms these living conditions in his The Foundations of the 19th Century. In the 13th century, when the Teutonic races began to build their new world, the agriculturalist over nearly the whole of Europe was a freer man, with a more assured existence than he is today. Copyhold was the rule, so that England, for example, today a seat of landlordism, was even in the 15th century almost entirely in the hands of thousands of farmers who were not only legal owners of their land, but possessed in addition far-reaching free rights to common pastures and woodland.
What?
I'm just gonna let that one sink in. With the average labourer required to work only 14 weeks in a year, many voluntarily gave of their time to build England's magnificent cathedrals. The York Minster was completed in 1472 and is the largest expanse of stained glass in the world. During their spare hours, many craftsmen volunteered their skills in building some of England's magnificent cathedrals, which reinforces one of the basic tenets of Western civilization, that without leisure time, the fostering of culture is not possible. George Macaulay Trevelyan, the English social historian, describes these accomplishments as follows. The continuous but ever-moving tradition of ecclesiastical architecture still proceeded on its majestic way, filling England with towering forests of masonry, of which the beauty and grandeur have never been rivalled either by the ancients or the moderns. In the newer churches, the light no longer crept but flooded in, through stained glass, of which the secret is today even more completely lost than the magic of the architecture. Although King Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, relaxed the laws regarding usury in 1509, they were subsequently repealed by his son King Edward VI, 1547 to 53, by an act of 1552, whose preamble stated that usury is by word of God utterly prohibited as a vice most odious and detestable. End of a golden era. During the 17th century, this golden era came to a tragic end. Large numbers of Jews who had been expelled from Spain in 1492 by Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, on account of their persistent involvement in usury and unethical business practices, had settled in Holland. Although the Dutch were at that time an important maritime power, the Jewish usurers based in Amsterdam desired to return to England, where their prospects for expanding the operations of their money-lending empire were far more promising. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, small numbers of Marranos, Spanish Jews, who had converted to a sham form of Christianity, settled in London. Many of them practiced as goldsmiths, accepting deposits of gold for safekeeping and then issuing 10 times the amount of gold received as gold receipts, that is, loans with interest. These receipts, a forerunner to the fraudulent fractional reserve system of banking, were initially lent to the Crown or Treasury at 8% per annum. But according to Samuel Pepys, the diarist and secretary to the Admiralty, the interest rate increased to as much as 20% and even 30% per annum. The rate of interest merchants paid often exceeded 33% per annum, even though the legal rate was only 6% per annum. Workmen and poor people bore the brunt of these extortionate rates, of interest by having to pay 60, 70 or even 80% per annum. According to Michael Godfrey, the author of a pamphlet entitled A Short Account of the Bank of England, £2 to £3 million had been lost through the bankruptcies of goldsmiths and the disappearance of their clerks. Now we get on to the really juicy stuff. Cromwell and the English Civil War. In 1534, by the Act of Supremacy, the Church of England was established as the official religion of England by King Henry VIII. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Puritan beliefs based on the teachings of John Wycliffe and John Calvin gained an increasing number of adherents. The Puritans considered the Bible to be the true law of God and emphasized Bible reading, prayer and preaching, and the simplification of the ritual of the sacraments. The Stuart king, Charles I, 1625 to 49, who wished to maintain the preeminence of the Anglican Church, came into intensified conflict with the Puritans, who were making great progress in proselytizing the population. After the assassination of Charles's trusted friend and advisor, the Duke of Buckingham, in 1628, he gradually became more isolated. The growing religious division provided a perfect opportunity for exploitation by the Jewish conspirators. As Israel Disraeli, the father of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, wrote in The Life and Reign of Charles I, the nation was artfully divided into Sabbatarians and Sabbath breakers. In 1640, one of the leaders of the clandestine Jewish community, Fernandez Cavallal, a merchant and a spy, and also known as the Great Jew, organized an armed militia of about 10,000 operatives who were used to intimidate the people of London and sow confusion. Large numbers of pamphlets and leaflets were also distributed. Civil war soon followed between the Royalists, the Anglicans, and the Roundheads, the Puritans, and it lasted from 1642 to 1648. The Roundheads, with their new model army, were victorious, and an estimated 190,000 persons, or 3.8% of the population, died. A pamphlet of the late 1650s portrays Oliver Cromwell as the monarch of England. The leader of the Roundheads was Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658, whose new model army was not only outfitted and provisioned by the chief contractor and professional agitator Fernandez Cavallal, but also bankrolled by Jewish moneylenders in Amsterdam. The leader of the Dutch Jews, Manasseh ben Israel, sent begging petitions to Cromwell, asking that the Jews be allowed to emigrate to England in return for the financial favours which he had so generously arranged. The regicide of King Charles. The treachery to which Cromwell descended is revealed in correspondence between himself and, I can't read that, the something of Mulheim, Germany, 16th of June 1647, from Oliver Cromwell to Ebenezer Pratt. In return for financial support, will advocate admission of Jews to England. This, however, will not be possible with Charles as king. Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which do not at present exist. Therefore advise that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with the arrangements for procuring an assassin, though willing to help in his escape. The reply was dispatched. The following 12th of July, 1647. So just after a month later. To OC from Ebenezer Pratt. Will grant financial aid as soon as Charles removed and the Jews admitted. Assassination too dangerous. Charles will be given an opportunity to escape. His recapture will make trial and execution possible. The support will be liberal, but useless to discuss terms until trial commences. King Charles was staying as a virtual prisoner in Holmby House, Northamptonshire. On the 4th of June 1647, 500 revolutionaries seized the king, but then allowed him to escape to the Isle of Wight, where he was subsequently arrested. On the 5th of December 1648, the House of Commons decided that the king's concessions were satisfactory to a settlement. The execution of King Charles I from a contemporary engraving. Cromwell then purged the House of Commons with the assistance of Colonel Pride until there was only a rump of 50 members left, who then duly voted that the king be put on trial. Not a single English lawyer was prepared to draw up a charge sheet against the king. Eventually, it was provided by a Dutch Jew, Isaac Dorislaus. The king was forced to participate in a show trial in a high court of justice in which 2/3 of its members were levellers from the army. Charles refused to plead, but was found guilty and executed on the 30th of January. As the procession approached the scaffold, large numbers of the crowd shouted, "God save the king!" After the deed had been done, there was an enormous groan of anguish. Second Jewish migration. From the 7th to the 18th of December 1655, Cromwell, who was called the Protector, held a conference in Whitehall, London, in order to obtain approval for the large-scale immigration of Jews. In spite of the conference being packed with Cromwell's supporters, the overwhelming consensus of the delegates, who were mainly priests, lawyers and merchants, was that the Jews should not be permitted to enter England. In October 1656, the first Jews were surreptitiously allowed to land freely in England, and in spite of strong protests having been lodged to the subcommittee of the Council of State, who declared that these Jews would be a grave menace to the state and the Christian religion, the merchants without exception spoke against the admission of the Jews. They declared that the proposed immigrants would be morally harmful to the state, and their admission would enrich foreigners at the expense of the English. Cromwell died on the 3rd of September 1658 and was succeeded by his son Richard, who ruled for 9 months. Charles the first's son, Charles II, 1660 to 85, succeeded his executed father, although he would be the last English monarch to issue money, banknotes, in his own right. He made 2 fatal errors of governance. On the 1st of August 1663, he passed the euphemistically sounding Act for the Encouragement of Trade, which enabled the export of all foreign coins or bullion of gold or silver, free of interdict, regulation or duties of any kind. During the debate on the bill, the Earl of Anglesey presciently observed that it is dangerous to the peace of the kingdom when it shall be in the power of half a dozen or half a score of rich, discontented, or factious persons to make a bank an accumulation of our own coin and bullion beyond the seas, and leave us in want of money, when it shall no longer be in the king's power to prevent it. 3 years later, by means of an act for the encouragement of coinage, he permitted private persons, i.e. bankers and goldsmiths, to mint the coins of the realm at the Royal Mint, thereby acquire the considerable benefits of the seigniorage, the difference between the face value of the coins and their production costs, income for their own private account. Furthermore, it enabled them to increase or diminish the supply of money in circulation, and to raise or lower prices at will, to the great detriment of the general population. His brother, James II, 1685 to 88, his reign only lasted 3 years. He was a victim of unscrupulous pamphleteering and propaganda, which emanated mainly from Holland. A military expedition undertaken by Prince William of Orange eventually dethroned him. Although James's army was numerically superior, he was discouraged from attacking after John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, suddenly deserted him. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, Churchill subsequently received an annual stipend of 6,000 from the Dutch Jew Solomon de Medina in payment for his treasonous conduct. These vast sums of blood money enabled Churchill to proceed with the construction of Blenheim Palace, which was completed at his death in 1722. William of Orange's military campaign, like that of the other William the Conqueror in 1066, was financed by Jewish bankers. In return for their support, William III, 1689 to 1702, would surrender the royal prerogative of issuing England's money free of debt and interest to a consortium known as the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. A. N. Field, in All These Things, summarises these epochal events known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but which was in fact the infamous revolution, as follows. 33 years after Cromwell had let the Jews into Britain, a Dutch prince arrived from Amsterdam, surrounded by a whole swarm of Jews from that financial centre. Driving his royal father-in-law, James II, out of the kingdom, he graciously consented to ascend the throne of Britain. A very natural result following on this event was the inauguration of the national debt by the establishment 6 years later of the Bank of England for the purpose of lending money to the crown.
I think now would be a really good time to point out to everybody that this is where national debt started, so that the Bank of England, a bunch of Jews, could lend money to the king, and the people would have to pay that money back for the king. The king was never going to pay anything that he hadn't sucked out of, absolutely sucked out of in blood, sweat and tears from the people.
Britain had paid her way, and she went. Britain had paid her way as she went until the Jews arrived. The pawn shop was then opened, and the resulting situation in which the nation finds itself today.
Again, this is something else that I remember from college. I remember learning in college that the reason we had pawn shops and credit and all of that was because the Americans brought that culture with them with the Second World War. That's what I learned in college.
Could not be better described than in the words put by Shakespeare with prophetic vision in the mouth of the dying John of Gaunt.
This land of such dear souls, this dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shores beats black the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England, that was wont to conquer others, hath made a shameful conquest of itself.
Richard II, Act 2, Scene 1. The history of the second Jewish settlement in Britain is one long trial of parchment bonds shackling the nation in debt. Every step in the ascent of the Jew in the nation's affairs has been marked by the increase and multiplication of debt, the establishment of the Bank of England. The need for a privately owned central bank was fronted by a retired pirate, William Paterson, when he wrote a pamphlet in 1693 entitled A Brief Account of the Intended Bank of England. He would later boast that this bank hath the benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing. On Thursday the 21st of June 1694, subscription lists for the bank, which had a capital of 1.2 million, were opened. By the following Monday, this amount had been fully subscribed. The ostensible purpose of the bank was to lend King William 8% per annum to enable the prosecution of war, and in particular the conflict against Louis XIV of France, whose country was not on the usury system. The bank would thus receive from the Crown interest of £100,000 per annum, the additional £4,000 being an administrative fee. The bank also acquired the right to issue 1.2 million in banknotes without any gold cover. Prior to its listing, the bylaws of the bank were carefully scrutinised by Sergeant-at-Law Creswell Levins in order to ensure that the bank complied with its hidden purpose, to fleece the English people in perpetuity by allowing the creation of the nation's money and means of exchange out of nothing at interest. All this fake money was to be accompanied by compounding interest. Levins was a crypto-Jew, or Marano, who practiced as an advocate and later served as a judge. There was much opposition to the establishment of the bank Foremost were the goldsmiths and moneylenders who correctly foresaw that it would bring an end to their usurious racket of fractional reserve banking based on their gold receipts. Landowners and country gentry feared an escalation in interest rates as the bank would control the nation's money supply. There were allegations that the bank would favour certain merchants with low rates of interest. The biggest fear was that the bank would grow too powerful and would become the keystone in the financial world, would become the keystone of the commercial world. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened, as the Bank of England became the model on which all subsequent central banks were replicated. Formation of the Bank of England passed by an Act of Parliament, described as an Act for granting to their Majesties several rates and duties upon tonnage of ships and vessels. At that time, the House of Commons had 514 members, consisting of 243 Tories, 241 Whigs, and 28 members whose allegiance was unknown. About two-thirds of the members were country gentlemen, and it is believed that one of the 514 members, approximately 20%, were illiterate. That of the 514 members, approximately 20% were illiterate. The bank was debated in July 1694, the high point in summer, when most of the rural members were engaged in summer pursuits and the harvesting of their crops. On that fateful Friday, 27th of July 1694, when the Charter of Incorporation was granted, only 42 members were present, all of them Whigs, as the Tories opposed the bill, who all voted in favour of it. This begs the question as to what a quorum consisted of in those days. Dividend Day at the Bank of England, wood engraving print circa 1800. That's the picture in the background. The title of the bill made no mention of the proposed Bank of England, which is only described, or one might say, secreted two-thirds down the unintelligible verbiage, to the layman that is, of the bill. The opening sentence of the bill reads as follows: William and Mary, by the grace of God, King and Queen of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defenders of the faith, etc., to all whom these presents shall come greeting. The third sentence, which contains 242 words, starts, whereas in and by a certain act lately made in Parliament, entitled An Act for granting to their Majesties several rates and duties upon tonnage of ships and vessels, and upon beer and ale and other liquors, and securing certain recompenses and advantages in the said act mentioned, to such persons as such voluntarily advance the sum of £1,500,000 towards carrying on the war with France. It is other things enacted. The gist of the first two-thirds of the bill details the necessity to levy a complicated array of new rates, duties and taxes upon ships, beer, ale and other liquors. The true purpose of these taxes was that they were needed in order to fund the interest on all future government loans. Therefore, shortly thereafter, further taxes were introduced including land tax, paper tax, poll tax, salt tax, stamp tax and window tax, which replaced the hearth or chimney tax. Other taxes initiated were a tax on peddlers, a tax on hackney coaches, a tax on births, marriages and deaths, and lastly, a tax on bachelors. However, the most punitive tax introduced was an income tax levied at a rate of 20%. It was applied not only to companies, but labourers too. War and debt slavery in perpetuity. Henceforth a pattern would emerge where unnecessary wars would be embarked on, which simultaneously increased the national debt and the profits of the usurers. Significantly, most of these wars were started against countries that had implemented interest-free state banking systems, as was the case in the North American colonies and France under Napoleon. The pattern of attacking and enforcing the bankers' system of usury has been deployed widely in the modern era and includes the defeat of the Imperial Russia in World War I, Germany, Italy and Japan in World War II, and most recently Libya in 2011. These were all countries which had state banking systems which distributed the wealth of their respective nations on an equitable basis and provided the populations with a standard of living far superior to that of their rivals and contemporaries.
Imagine that. Imagine having a leadership that took care of you. Imagine if your country actually gave back to you as a civilian, as a citizen, and you experienced dividends in some way from the wealth that your country was generating. Imagine that, eh? Imagine that. Fairy tale.
Within 2 years of its establishment in 1696, the Bank of England had 1.75 million worth of banknotes circulating, with a gold reserve of only 2%, or 36,000. On the 1st of May 1711, the union between Scotland and England was established, motivated in no small way by the necessity to seize control of the Royal Mint in Edinburgh, which took place in 1709. By 1720, after the conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, the national debt had risen to 30 million.
Now I'm pretty sure I could bet all the money in the world that nobody asked the people if they were prepared to pay back the king's debt for him by way of a national debt. Just saying.
With the war itself having cost 50 million. After the American War of Independence, 1775 to 83, which had been fought after the colonists had been forced to replace their debt and largely interest-free colonial scrip with English money, and had resulted in 50% unemployment, the national debt soared to 176 million. According to Sir John Harold Clapham, who wrote The Bank of England, A History, 1694 to 1914, in 1944, Solomon de Medina and two de Costas, Fonseca, Henriquez, Mendez, Nunes, Rodriguez, Salvador, and Teixeira de Matos, who were all Sephardic Jews, had acquired the majority of the bank's shares by 1722. In 1786, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger tried to abolish the national debt with a sinking fund which generated interest of £1 million per annum to repay the debt. This scheme was soon abandoned because of the enormous increase in loans incurred to finance the war against Napoleon.
Ding, 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 ding. Excuse me. Wow. Is this not like the MO? Oh, look. Oh, there's going to be a war. You need to borrow the money. Oh, no. You're going to have to put all that on hold and stop doing all that nonsense, aren't you? Because there's going to be a war and you're going to have to borrow the money.
In 1797, in order to pay for the burgeoning interest burden, a system of graduated income tax had to be introduced, which by 1815 was yielding 70 million per annum. The war against France lasted from 1792 until 1815. Among the principal objectives of this pointless bloodletting was to destroy Napoleon's debt-free and interest-free system of finance. During this period, England also waged war against the United States from 1812 to 1814. This war, as was the case with the war against France, was instigated by England at the behest of banker Mayle Amschel Rothschild.
This happens to be Mr. Rothschild's favourite MO, to cause war, to cause civil war, to cause revolution, to tell lies in order to manipulate markets for his own benefit and wealth. He actually does the same thing concerning Napoleon and the English, and he told the English that we'd lost the war with Napoleon, which caused the currency to crash. The Bank of England, the value of the English pound plummeted. Rothschild bought the Bank of England for pennies on the pound. He basically scooped it up for nothing and got in full control of UK currency through a lie, and everybody just let him get away with it. Like, oh well played, Mr. Rothschild.
Real name Bauer, after the United States Congress refused to renew the charter of the Rothschild-controlled Bank of the United States, which had been the central bank of America from 1791 to 1811. Mayor Amschel Rothschild is famously credited with having said, "Give me control of the economics of a country, and I care not who makes her laws. The few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favours that there will be no opposition from that class." British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval, 1809 to 12, tried to stop this completely futile war, but was assassinated on the 11th of May 1812 in the lobby of the House of Commons by John Bellingham, a political radical who had been set up by Rothschild. In 1815, the national debt had ballooned to 885 million. This completely unnecessary war resulted in approximately 3 million military personnel and at least 1 million civilians losing their lives. In order to destroy Napoleon's state bank, it cost the deluded British public a staggering 831 million, of which only over 2.5 billion was still outstanding in 1914. The principal of 504 million had over the intervening period increased fivefold as a result of the compounding effect of interest. An astute agrarian and parliamentarian, William Cobbett, 1763 to 1835, at that time perceived what was afoot and wrote as follows: "I set to read the Act of Parliament by which the Bank of England was created. The investors knew what they were about, their design to mortgage by degrees the whole country, lands, houses, property, labour. This scheme has produced what the world never saw before, starvation in the midst of abundance." In 1800, a Member of Parliament, Sir William Pulteney, proposed the formation of a national bank after having made vigorous attacks against the bank. In 1824, another Member of Parliament, David Ricardo, submitted a detailed plan to convert the Bank of England into a national bank. Both attempts failed. The affairs of the Bank of England remained secret, and it was not until 1833, 139 years later, that a sanitised version of its accounts was presented to Parliament by means of the Act of 1833. At the start of World War I in 1914, the national debt stood at 650 million. On the 31st of March 19, it had increased to 7.434 billion, of which 3 billion is still outstanding after 95 years at an interest rate of 3.5% per annum. In the 19 budget, 40% of expenditure was allocated to the payment of interest. In World War II, the national debt rose by almost 300%, from 7.1 billion in 1839 to 20.1 billion in 1945.
Are you paying attention? Because yes, I am talking to you, listening right now. I hope you have made a note of just how much the national debt has increased, how much it increased between World War I and World War II and World War II and now. And the reason national debt exists because our king had an issue with the French leader. Nobody was asked. No vote took place. Nobody approached the king and said, "Hey, look, we need to go to war with France. We'll pitch in. Do you want to take out a loan with the Bank of England? And we'll be guarantees for it. Yeah, we'll pay your loan. We'll pay all the money. We'll pay it all back. You just borrow as much as you want, and we'll pay it back, earning a penny a day." Did anybody, like, seriously? Everybody's okay with the status quo as it is. What the actual?
As at March 2017, it stands at over 1.8 trillion. However, if one includes all liabilities, including state and public pensions, it exceeds 5 trillion. Nationalisation. On the 14th of February 1946, the Labour government nationalised the Bank of England. The shareholders received treasury notes to the value of £11 £15,100, which were redeemable after 20 years. This nationalisation, which supposedly placed the bank under public control, did not introduce any change to the privately run system of fractional reserve banking and was undertaken purely for propaganda purposes as part of the Labour Party's nationalisation programme of certain financial industrial concerns. On the 6th of April 1674, on the 6th of April 1974, the Bank of England established the Bank of England Nominees Limited Company registration number 1307478, a wholly owned subsidiary with private shareholders holding over 100 £1 shares, of which 50% were sold. There is a suspicion that this rearrangement of the bank's affairs represented a reverse takeover of it by private shareholders. In view of the fact that certain aspects of the Bank of England's operations are protected by its Royal Charter, Section 27(9) of the Companies Act of 1976 and the Official Secrets Act of 1989, and are therefore not subject to public and parliamentary scrutiny, there may well be substance to this allegation.
Shut it down!
How much longer are you going to put up with this shit? Sitting there letting them tell you what to do, what to think, what to say, who you can be with, telling you that you're the reason for climate change while they fly around in their jets, stealing all your money.